lot of people like to say that Trump has an ego, but you have somebody in the highest position of power that shouldn't be there, and he still won't step aside in Joe Biden's case. So the Democratic Party is in a catch-22, I believe, of their own making, and they really don't have a lot of options moving forward.
Well, let's speak to Catalina Lauf, a former Republican candidate for Congress and a Donald Trump supporter. Catalina, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm intrigued for your take on all of this because part of me wonders if you're somewhat reveling in Joe Biden's, well, demise, let's be honest. But part of me also wonders if the patriot in you wonders if this is actually really quite harmful for this election process.
Republican strategist Andrea Tantaros put this perfectly, and I think this is what a lot of us are feeling right now. No matter how much we dislike the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, we love this country more. And the reality is that, Biden is putting us in a very vulnerable position by staying in. I don't believe he has the moral courage to ultimately leave. If he did, he wouldn't have pursued this from the beginning. We all know that he had a mental decline 4 years ago, and the Democratic Party knew that. So they essentially led us all under false pretenses. And, a lot of people like to say that Trump has an ego, but you have somebody in the highest position of power that shouldn't be there, and he still won't step aside in Joe Biden's case. So the Democratic Party is in a catch-22, I believe, of their own making, and they really don't have a lot of options moving forward.
So what does that mean, though, for Donald Trump? Because part of the consideration here must be if Biden is so incapacitated, why is Trump not running away with this thing?
Yeah, well, ultimately, I believe he will, and November will ultimately be the judge of that. And again, there are only really two options here that the Democratic Party can do, and one of them is the convention process and the nominee process there. It's not the primaries that necessarily determine the nominee. It's actually the convention. So if they wanted to say bring in a candidate that they believe is better for the job, then they can essentially do that at the convention in August. And so really that hasn't been from a historical precedent standpoint. The last time that really happened was in 1980, and that was the battle between Carter and Senator Edward Kennedy. And what happened with that, which I believe is going to happen in this race, it's really setting up a Trump victory. And that's because, the American people really hated Carter in the 1980s. So they wanted to bring in a new candidate. And what did that lead to? Well, Carter won that battle at the nomination at the convention. And ultimately, Reagan had a massive landslide and victory. He carried states and had a massive historical victory. And I believe that will happen in November with Trump as well.
So who should Trump fear if Joe Biden is to be replaced? Who is the most intimidating candidate for him? And don't say no one, Catalina. I know what you don't take the line.
To be honest, they don't have a bench. The names that they're floating out, and this is to be completely frank, people like Gavin Newsom are way too progressive for where the party is going. Obviously, today is very progressive, but you need to win a majority of the independent in the moderate vote. And so I don't believe that the Democratic Party, somebody like RFK, for example, they fear him, the Democratic Party. So they're not going to allow
Robert Kennedy.
Robert Kennedy, right? He won't, the Democratic Party, the elites in that party won't have somebody like him win the Democratic nominee. So they don't have a bench. And their only other option is Kamala Harris. And the only way to do that is if they invoke the 25th Amendment, which is quite a possibility. It's highly unlikely, but it's still a possibility. And that is if the Democratic Party the cabinet level, so the people who are most loyal to the president, who are supposed to be the most loyal, invoke the 25th Amendment, which essentially says that Kamala Harris is then the vice president takes over the duties. And I don't believe the Democratic Party has the moral courage to do that, or the cabinet levels to say, hey, look, this person shouldn't be in office. He should not be the president. Let's do what's right by the American people and start the formal 25th Amendment process. That's not going to happen. So I believe, again, they're in a catch-22, and Donald Trump has, this is a clear win for him in November.
I suppose as well, we have to keep separate in our minds the two things here, the candidacy and the presidency, because the two things are separate in terms of Joe Biden could stand down as candidate but remain as president is potentially one option.
Yes, but ultimately, if he remains a candidate, and then he loses in November, then you're still in the same position where President Trump wins. So, and then again, if he, by the time August comes around, so if they want to invoke the 25th Amendment now, for example, they start that process, then you still have to go through the campaign process as well, which again, there is no Democrat that can defeat Donald Trump. Joe Biden can't defeat Donald Trump. You know, you have a lot of independents and moderates that are looking at Joe Biden today and say, wow, this guy is very mentally impaired and he's leaving the country vulnerable. Let's do what's right.
Yeah. It's a fascinating time, Catalina. How should Donald Trump play this? Because we saw that first debate last weekend where actually Donald Trump was relatively considerate in that he didn't kind of steamroll Biden, where, arguably he probably could have. Does that last as a strategy? Does he need to own this at some point and, yes, steamroll him?
You know, ultimately, it's the people can see it. You know, Donald Trump doesn't have to be sitting there steamrolling Joe Biden. You actually see a lot of empathy coming from Donald Trump during that debate. You know, he's looking at him in a very kind of empathetic way that this guy doesn't know where he is. And so I don't think Donald Trump needs to steamroll him. I think not only is the record, Joe Biden's record, horrible for him at this point, but also who he is as a leader, which is not very much of one. So the people can ultimately see that. And I think Donald Trump should take the high road here and just focus on why he's a better leader. We saw that under 4 years of his administration. I had the honor of working at that administration. And, you know, his policy agenda really delivered for the American people. And we see that contrast very clearly 4 years under Donald Trump and 4 years under Biden. And again, I think Donald Trump needs to focus on the issues and focus on that enthusiasm, because ultimately, too, we have to also say that, look, people aren't enthusiastic to vote for Joe Biden at this
Mm.
point. So they're not going to be enthusiastic even voting for a Kamala if that ends up being the case. And so they really need to focus on voter turnout. And right now, the Republicans have the momentum on their side, and Trump has the momentum on his side.
Catalina, it's really fascinating speaking to you.